Hello everyone and welcome to Wormwood Tales. Relax and enjoy the story for sleep video. Before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Let's begin. Before you settle into your bed tonight, I want you to do something simple but powerful. Turn off your lights, and let the room fall into complete darkness. Take a moment to feel the quiet around you. Now, as you lie back, open your eyes and look into the black screen in front of you. Let it become a doorway into the unknown. In the stillness, you'll find a world waiting for you. A world where light is a distant memory and darkness holds the answers. Take a deep breath and let go of everything around you. You're about to step into a place where the only thing that matters is what you can't see. Look into the black screen. Let it consume you. Let it follow you into sleep, and remember, it's not just a screen. It's a doorway. Alright, let's begin. On a fog-drenched night in the heart of New Orleans, the French Quarter hums with life. Street performers play soulful jazz, and the air is thick with the scent of beignet and Creole spices. But at the corner of Royal Street, a group of tourists stands frozen, their lively chatter silenced as they face the towering silhouette of the Lalaurie mansion. The guide, a wiry man with a weathered face and a faint Cajun accent, pauses dramatically. His lantern casts long, flickering shadows against the mansion's cracked facade. This house, he begins, his voice trembling, has seen unimaginable darkness. The kind that seeps into your soul and never lets go. The crowd shifts uneasily. A middle-aged man pulls his jacket tighter as if to ward off a sudden chill. A teenager nudges her friend, whispering nervously, "Do you think it's really haunted?" The guide leans closer, lowering his voice. "Some say you can still hear the screams of the tortured at night," he continues, his eyes scanning the second-story windows. "Others claim to have seen Madame Lalaurie herself, standing right there." He points to one particular window, its glass shimmering ominously in the lantern's glow, watching. A woman near the back gasps as something flickers in the very window the guide indicated. Her hand flies to her mouth. "Did you see that?" she whispers, her voice tinged with panic. A nervous laugh escapes her lips, but no one joins in. The group huddles closer together, their faces pale in the dim light. The oppressive air presses against them, heavy with an unseen presence. It's as though the mansion itself is alive, its empty windows acting as hollow eyes, watching their every move. The guide exhales sharply, breaking the spell. "Now, if y'all think you're brave enough," he says, a ghost of a smile tugging at his lips, "step a little closer. I'll tell you what really happened here." The tourists obey, some reluctantly, their feet shuffling against the cobblestones. But as they gather near the wrought iron gate, each of them feels it, the mansion isn't just a building. It's a predator, biding its time. "This isn't just a haunted house," the guide whispers. "It's a trap." And as the fog swirls thicker around them, the story takes hold like a vice. The Lalaurie mansion stands on Royal Street like a sentinel of sorrow, its pale facade concealing centuries of horror. Beneath the ornate balconies and shuttered windows lies a truth so grim that few dare to linger for long. Locals avoid walking too close after sunset, muttering prayers or clutching charms to ward off evil. Yet tonight, a curious group gathers outside, clutching their jackets against the damp chill of the New Orleans air. The tour guide, an older man with deep-set eyes and a voice like gravel, steps into the dim light of a flickering gas lamp. He clears his throat, his hand shaking slightly as he gestures to the mansion. "This," he begins, his voice low and deliberate, "is no ordinary haunted house. What you see before you is the stuff of nightmares, a place where history itself has bled into the walls." The group shifts uneasily, their attention riveted. One man, trying to appear brave, chuckles. "You mean this tourist trap? Come on, it's all exaggerated for the tours, right?" The guide's lips press into a thin line. "You think so?" He glances toward the darkened windows of the mansion. People who come here with that attitude don't last long. Let me tell you a story. A few years ago, a woman on this very tour decided she'd had enough of my exaggerations. She marched right up to the front door, put her hand on the knocker, and dared the spirits to do their worst. The group leans in, even the skeptical man. What happened? Someone whispers. The guide lowers his voice. She screamed before her hand even touched the wood. She said she felt something grab her wrist, something ice cold. When she pulled away, there were marks on her arm. She didn't finish the tour. And she didn't speak another word the entire night. The woman next to him shivers, pulling her scarf tighter. You're making that up, she says, though her voice lacks conviction. The guide doesn't respond immediately. Instead, he turns toward the mansion and raises his lantern, casting a golden glow over its facade. I wish I was. But this place has a way of leaving its mark on anyone foolish enough to challenge it. A sudden gust of wind sweeps down the street, rattling the shutters on the upper floor. One of the windows creaks open slightly, the gap yawning like a dark mouth. A young woman at the back of the group gasps and points. There. Did you see that? Someone's up there. All heads snap toward the second floor. For a moment, they see nothing, just the empty window and the deep shadows behind it. But then, faintly, the outline of a figure materializes. A pale face, too smooth to be human, with hollow, unblinking eyes. The guide lowers his lantern and steps back. If you're lucky, that's all you'll see tonight, he says grimly. But if you're not, well, I wouldn't wish that on anyone. The skeptical man, now visibly uneasy, mutters, it's just a trick of the light. The guide doesn't argue. Instead, he continues, his tone heavier now. This house has been called many things, a symbol of the city's dark past, a cursed landmark, even a portal to something far worse. But for over 2 centuries, one name has endured, the house of Madame Lalaurie. He pauses, letting the name hang in the air like a curse. And if you think the stories are just legends, you're welcome to find out for yourself. No one volunteers. The guide nods knowingly, stepping closer to the group. They say Madame Lalaurie's victims still walk these halls. That their suffering was so great, it burned an echo into this place, one that can never be silenced. Those who hear their cries never forget them. And sometimes, he pauses, his eyes darting to the upstairs window again. Sometimes, they don't come back at all. The lantern flickers, casting long, dancing shadows on the mansion's walls. A distant sound like the faint scraping of chains drifts on the wind, barely audible but unmistakable. The guide lowers his voice to a whisper. So, if you feel someone brush past you, or hear footsteps that aren't your own, don't turn around. Whatever you do, don't look back. The group huddles closer together, their nerves fraying. Somewhere, deep within the mansion, a faint light flickers behind a curtain. It's gone as quickly as it appeared, but the effect is chilling. The guide glances at his watch. That concludes the tour. For those of you brave enough to continue, the mansion's doors are right there. But I wouldn't recommend it. He takes a step back, his face pale but composed. Whatever you choose, remember this, the Lalaurie mansion never forgets. And it never forgives? As the group disperses, a few linger, staring at the foreboding building. The young woman who saw the face in the window swears she hears something, a faint, mournful wail. She shakes her head, telling herself it's the wind. But as she walks away, she can't shake the feeling that she's being watched. The night was cool, but the air around the Lalaurie mansion felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the walls themselves exhaled memories of pain and suffering. Beneath the gaslight's wavering glow, a crowd of eager tourists clustered together, their eyes drawn to the mansion's looming facade. The guide, an older man with a creased face and a voice weathered by years of recounting morbid tales, held a flickering lantern in one hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone hushed yet commanding, "what you see before you is no ordinary house. The Lalaurie mansion is one of the most haunted locations in the United States, if not the world." A murmur ran through the group. Some glanced up nervously at the darkened windows, while others clutched their jackets tighter as if the chill in the air came not from the weather but from something unseen. Madame Delphine Lalaurie, the guide continued, was once the toast of New Orleans society. Her soirees were the talk of the town, attended by the city's elite, who marveled at her charm and beauty. But behind closed doors, she was a woman of unspeakable cruelty. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the group. A faint breeze stirred the Spanish moss hanging from nearby trees, adding an eerie whisper to the moment. "They say," the guide's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, "that her victims never left this house. That their spirits linger here, trapped by the horrors they endured. Some nights, passers-by have reported hearing screams, terrible, gut-wrenching screams coming from within these very walls." A young man in the group chuckled nervously, breaking the silence. "Sounds like a tourist trap," he muttered. The guide turned sharply to face him, his expression grim. "A trap, you say? Perhaps. But not for tourists. For souls. Many who have doubted the stories of this place have found themselves, regretting their curiosity." The group shuffled uncomfortably, their unease growing. As if on cue, a faint, rhythmic tapping echoed from somewhere within the mansion. The sound was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, steadier, as if someone or something was pacing the floors above them. "Is someone up there?" a woman asked, her voice trembling. The guide didn't answer immediately. He lifted his lantern and shone it toward the upper windows, the flickering light casting long, dancing shadows. "There shouldn't be," he said finally. "But this house has a way of defying expectations." A faint figure seemed to glide past one of the second-story windows. Gasps rippled through the group. "It's just the wind," someone whispered, though their voice betrayed doubt. The guide lowered his lantern. "In this house," he said, "the wind doesn't explain much." He stepped closer to the group, his voice dropping low as if sharing a forbidden secret. "Legend has it that Madame Lalaurie was forced to flee the city after a fire exposed her atrocities. But before she left, she swore revenge on anyone who dared to uncover her secrets. Some believe her spirit still roams these halls, protecting what she left behind. Others say the house itself has become a vessel for the evil she wrought." The tourists stood motionless, their eyes darting between the guide and the mansion. The tension was palpable, the kind of oppressive silence that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand on end. Then, without warning, a loud thud reverberated from inside the house. A woman let out a startled scream, and several people took a step back. The guide raised a hand to calm them, but his own expression betrayed a flicker of fear. "It's just the house settling," he said, though his voice was less confident now. "Or, perhaps it's the spirits welcoming us." A nervous laugh escaped from the crowd, though it sounded hollow. One brave soul, a young man with a camera slung around his neck, stepped forward. "Can we go inside?" he asked, his tone half challenging, half hopeful. The guide shook his head slowly. "Not tonight," he said. "The mansion doesn't take kindly to unexpected visitors after dark." As if to punctuate his words, the lantern's flame sputtered, casting the group into momentary darkness. When the light returned, the guide's face was set in a mask of warning. "Take my advice," he said firmly. "Do not linger near this house longer than you must. Many who've tried have found themselves changed." The group began to disperse, their nerves clearly frayed. But as they turned to leave, one woman paused, her gaze fixed on an upper window. "What is it?" someone asked her. She pointed, her finger trembling. "I thought I saw someone looking out at us." The group followed her gaze, but the window was empty. The guide, noticing their hesitation, stepped between them and the mansion. "Go home," he urged. "Before the house decides it wants you to stay." With that, the tourists hurried off into the night, their footsteps echoing against the cobblestones. But the woman who had seen the figure lingered a moment longer, her eyes scanning the dark windows. From deep within the mansion, a faint, high-pitched laugh echoed. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. When she finally turned to leave, she swore she felt eyes following her every step. The Lalaurie mansion stood silent once more, its secrets locked away or waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to come knocking. It was a humid evening in the French Quarter, the kind where the air clings to your skin and every sound seems amplified in the stillness. The Lalaurie mansion loomed at the corner of Royal and Governor Nichols streets, its darkened windows like unblinking eyes. Even among the historic and haunted streets of New Orleans, this house was different. People didn't just tell ghost stories about it, they warned each other to keep their distance. Tour groups lingered near its iron gates but never too close, as though the building itself might reach out and ensnare them. Tonight was no different. A small group gathered under the gaslights, their guide weaving a story as sinister as the shadows pooling at their feet. "The Lalaurie mansion," he began, his voice hushed as if the house might overhear, "is no ordinary haunted home. The spirits here are not restless, they are angry. They don't want you here. And they don't forgive." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the group. The faint murmur of jazz music floated on the breeze from a bar down the street, but it seemed a world away. All that existed now was the house and its dark history. "They say Madame Delphine Lalaurie was the most beautiful woman in the French Quarter. Elegant, charming, and endlessly wealthy. Her parties were the talk of the town. But behind these walls," the guide motioned to the house, his flashlight illuminating the ornate ironwork, "she was a monster. Her slaves endured horrors that make the bravest souls shudder." A middle-aged man in the group cleared his throat nervously. "What kind of horrors?" he asked, though his trembling voice suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to know. The guide hesitated, then stepped closer to the group, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Chains in the attic. Vivisections. People kept in cages, starved, and mutilated. When the fire broke out in 1834, the neighbors discovered what she had been hiding. Some of them couldn't even stomach what they saw. They say it was the screams that gave it away." As if on cue, the wind shifted, rustling the leaves of the gnarled trees lining the street. The tourists instinctively glanced up at the windows of the mansion. One woman, clutching her jacket tightly, swore she saw movement, a flutter of shadow behind the second-story glass. The guide chuckled dryly, though his eyes betrayed unease. "You're not the first to think you saw something. People have reported figures in the windows for years. Some say it's Madame Lalaurie herself, still watching over her domain. Others claim it's the spirits of her victims, trapped here for eternity." Another voice piped up, a younger woman at the back of the group. "Has anyone actually gone inside? Like, recently?" The guide's expression darkened. "Oh, people have gone in. Paranormal investigators. Skeptics. Thrill seekers. But none of them stay long. And the ones who do," he trailed off, his eyes flicking back to the mansion. "Let's just say, the house has a way of taking something from you. Some lose their sanity. Others lose something far worse." The group fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down on them like the oppressive humidity. The mansion stood before them, as still and ominous as ever. But now, it felt alive, watching, waiting. The guide cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "I'll tell you one last thing before we move on. A few years ago, a man stayed the night in the mansion. He was writing a book about the history of New Orleans and thought he could handle whatever ghosts might be there. He lasted until dawn. When his colleagues found him, he was sitting on the steps outside, staring at nothing. He wouldn't speak a word, not even to say what happened. What happened to him? The older man asked. The guide shrugged, his flashlight beam flickering across the cracked facade. He disappeared a few weeks later. His book was never published. But sometimes, people say they see him, too, in the windows. The younger woman scoffed nervously, trying to shake off the growing tension. Come on, these are just stories, right? There's no proof. The guide smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. Stories or not, the Lalaurie mansion doesn't care whether you believe. It remembers everyone who steps through its doors. And sometimes, it doesn't let them leave. Just then, a faint sound carried on the breeze, a low, mournful wail, so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind. But the group froze, every head turning toward the house. The guide quickly ushered them away, his tone brisk now. That's enough for tonight, he said, his voice betraying a note of urgency. Let's move on to the next stop. As the group reluctantly followed him down the street, one man lingered a moment longer, staring at the second-story window where the woman had seen movement. For a fleeting second, he thought he saw a pale face staring back at him, a face that didn't belong to anyone living. Shaking his head, he hurried to catch up, but the mansion stayed with him, its oppressive presence seared into his memory. For those who dared to listen to its story, the Lalaurie mansion had a way of never letting go. The air in the French Quarter was thick with humidity, carrying the scent of rain-soaked cobblestones and magnolias. Among the narrow streets and vibrant jazz bars stood the Lalaurie mansion, its dark facade untouched by time. No matter how bustling the city became, this house seemed to hold its own sinister silence, a void in the lively atmosphere. People whispered about it, pointing nervously as they passed. Tourists took hurried photos from across the street but never lingered. The mansion's windows, dark and unyielding, seemed to watch everyone with an oppressive gaze. Some said they felt cold chills walking past, even on the hottest Louisiana days. Others swore they saw a shadow moving in the windows when the house was supposed to be empty. Tonight was no different. A crowd had gathered for one of the city's famous ghost tours, the guide, a wiry man named Patrick, standing at the head of the group with a lantern in hand. His voice was gravelly, whether from years of storytelling or something stronger, and it had a way of pulling you in, even if you didn't want to hear what he had to say. This is the Lalaurie mansion, Patrick began, his tone low and somber. The group leaned in closer, their nervous chatter fading into silence. You've all heard of it, I'm sure. The most haunted house in America, they call it. But what makes it so haunted? Let me tell you, it isn't just ghosts. It's what happened here. The things people did. Things that should never have been done. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The group shifted uneasily, their faces lit by the soft orange glow of the street lamps. In the 1830s, Patrick continued, this was the home of Madame Delphine Lalaurie, one of New Orleans' wealthiest socialites. By all accounts, she was a woman of refinement and elegance. She threw the most extravagant parties, and the elite of the city would gather here to drink, dance, and mingle. He motioned toward the house, its darkened windows like empty eyes staring down at them. But what they didn't know, Patrick's voice dropped, forcing the group to lean in even closer, was what happened beyond those walls when the music stopped and the guests went home. Madame Lalaurie, she was no ordinary woman. Beneath her charm and beauty was a heart as cold and dark as this very house. A woman in the group gasped softly, clutching her partner's arm. Patrick turned his gaze on her, his expression grave. What I'm about to tell you isn't a story for the faint of heart. It's not a fairy tale or a cautionary tale. It's the truth, or at least as much of it as we know. The rest, he glanced up at the mansion, his voice trailing off for a moment before he continued. The rest, only the house remembers. The crowd seemed to hold their breath as Patrick began recounting the horrors. He spoke of the enslaved people under Madame Lalaurie's control, how neighbors sometimes heard screams in the dead of night but dared not interfere. People whispered about the disappearances, Patrick said. Servants who came here and were never seen again. But no one wanted to cross the Lalauries. They were powerful, untouchable. His voice grew heavier as he described the night of the fire in 1834, when the truth finally came to light. A fire broke out in the kitchen, Patrick said, started by a desperate woman, one of the enslaved cooks who had been chained to the stove for days. When the fire brigade arrived, they found something no one was prepared for, a hidden chamber upstairs. A place where unspeakable things were done. Torture. Experiments. Cruelty beyond imagination. Patrick let the words hang in the air, his audience now visibly uneasy. One man glanced nervously at the mansion, as if expecting to see something staring back at him. Some of the victims were barely alive, Patrick continued, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. They told stories of the horrors they endured. Stories that haunt the city to this day. And as for Madame Lalaurie? She vanished that very night, slipping away into the darkness before she could face justice. Some say she fled to France. Others believe she never left at all. A cold breeze swept through the street, and several people shivered despite the warm night. Patrick seemed to notice, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It's said her spirit still lingers here, he added, along with the souls of those who suffered at her hands. Some people claim they've seen her face in the upstairs window, looking down at them. Others have heard voices, footsteps, screams. But one thing is certain, no one leaves this house without taking a piece of its darkness with them. At that moment, a young woman at the back of the group let out a startled cry. Everyone turned, their eyes wide with alarm. I thought I saw someone," she stammered, pointing to the second-story window. "A woman, in a black dress." Patrick didn't flinch. "Well," he said calmly, "perhaps Madame Lalaurie wanted to join us tonight." A nervous laugh rippled through the group, but it didn't last long. The unease was palpable now, a weight pressing down on them all. Patrick took a step back, gesturing toward the house. "We won't go inside, of course," he said. "No one does these days. But if you're brave enough to linger here a little longer, you just might hear the mansion whispering its secrets." The group hesitated, their curiosity battling with their fear. The mansion loomed above them, silent and still, yet somehow alive with an invisible energy. One by one, they began to drift away, eager to escape the oppressive presence of the house. As the last of the group disappeared into the night, Patrick turned back to the mansion, his expression unreadable. He tipped his hat, murmuring under his breath, "Good night, madam." And for just a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of movement in the window. A pale face. Watching. Waiting. The night in New Orleans was unseasonably cold, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones and refused to let go. A group of tourists shuffled uneasily on the uneven cobblestones of Royal Street, their murmurs fading as their guide paused dramatically in front of the towering Lalaurie mansion. The building loomed like a shadow, its pale, cracked facade catching the dim light of the gas lamps. Even among the countless haunted places in the French Quarter, this house stood apart, an architectural tombstone for unspeakable horrors. The guide, a wiry man with a weathered face and an unervingly soft voice, adjusted his top hat and smiled thinly. His tone dropped, each word deliberately spaced as though every syllable carried a weight too heavy for ordinary speech. "This is the infamous Lalaurie mansion," he began, gesturing to the darkened windows. "It's been called the most haunted house in America, and with good reason. But this is no ordinary ghost story. What happened here, what continues to happen here, goes far beyond flickering lights or creaking floors." He paused, letting his words sink in, as one of the tourists, a woman clutching her partner's arm, shifted uneasily. "They say the house remembers," he added, almost a whisper. "And for those who linger too long, the house never forgets." A young man in the group chuckled nervously, shoving his hands into his jacket pockets. "Come on," he said, his voice just a little too loud. "It's just a house. A creepy old house, sure, but haunted? That's just a gimmick for tourists, right?" The guide turned his head sharply, fixing the man with a gaze so intense it seemed to silence the very street around them. For a moment, no one spoke, the weight of the silence pressing down on them all. Then, the guide's lips curled into a faint smile, more a baring of teeth than an expression of warmth. "Would you like to step inside and find out?" he asked, his voice almost daring. The man's bravado faltered, and he shook his head, muttering something about being good out here. The guide exhaled, his breath visible in the cold night air, and turned back to the group. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small, worn notebook. Flipping it open, he began to read aloud, his voice echoing off the surrounding buildings. "October 31st, 1989, he recited. "A young couple decided to spend the night here on a dare. The house had been abandoned for years, its reputation enough to keep even squatters away. The next morning, the police found their car parked out front, but the couple was never seen again. Inside the house, the investigators found the remains of a tape recorder, crushed as if by tremendous force. The tape inside was mostly static, but there were a few audible seconds." He stopped, looking at the group. "Do you know what it said?" No one answered, their eyes wide with apprehension. The guide leaned in closer, his voice barely a whisper. "It said, 'Get out.'" The woman clutching her partner let out a small gasp, and someone behind her muttered a curse under their breath. But the guide wasn't done. "This house has devoured lives," he continued. "And it all began with one woman. Madame Delphine Lalaurie. To the world, she was a charming socialite, the envy of New Orleans society. But behind these walls," he gestured at the mansion, his face darkening. "She committed atrocities so vile that even the bravest men in the city fled in terror when they discovered her secrets." A sudden gust of wind rushed down the street, rattling the shutters of the mansion and sending an involuntary shiver through the group. The guide closed his notebook with a snap, letting the silence hang for a moment. "Now," he said, taking a step closer to the group, "some say you can still hear the screams of her victims if you stand here long enough. Others claim to have seen her, staring down from the second-floor window. And sometimes," his voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, "you might hear her calling your name." The group instinctively glanced up at the windows, their breath catching as a flicker of movement seemed to ripple behind one of the curtains. It could have been a trick of the light. Or it could have been something else. The guide stepped back, adjusting his hat with a flourish. "So, my friends," he said, his tone lighter now, "shall we continue the tour? Or would anyone like to stay a little longer and introduce themselves to the house?" No one moved. As the group slowly shuffled away, one woman lingered at the back, her gaze fixed on the second floor. "Did you see that?" she whispered to her partner. "See what?" "The curtain," she said, her voice trembling. "It moved." But before he could respond, the guide turned to them with a knowing smile. "Careful now," he said. "The house doesn't like to be watched for too long. And neither does she." The couple hurried to catch up with the group, leaving the mansion behind. But as they turned the corner, the woman couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was still watching her. The Lalaurie mansion stands like a sentinel on Royal Street, its faded elegance betraying the horrors hidden within. Tourists pass by during the day, snapping photos of its wrought iron balconies and cracked shutters, unaware of the malevolence that lingers beneath its grand facade. But at night, when the streets are quiet and the heavy New Orleans air grows still, the mansion's true nature emerges. On this particular evening, a walking ghost tour gathers just outside the infamous house. Their guide, a man named Thomas with a gravelly voice and a weathered face, has been leading these tours for years. Yet, every time he stops in front of the Lalaurie mansion, he feels the same unease creeping up his spine, as though the house itself is listening. Thomas adjusts his hat, his fingers trembling slightly as he raises a lantern to cast an eerie glow on the mansion's facade. The group of about 20 people clusters around him, some clutching their phones to record his every word. A few laugh nervously, their chatter fading as Thomas begins to speak. "This, ladies and gentlemen, is the Lalaurie mansion," he starts, his voice low and deliberate. "A place so soaked in blood and suffering that it's said no soul who enters leaves unmarked. Some call it the most haunted house in America, but those who've lived here, well, they have other words for it. Words they won't even dare speak out loud." A young woman near the front of the group, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and holding her partner's arm, shudders. "Is it true what they say about the screams?" Thomas nods solemnly. "The screams, the shadows, the whispers, they're all true. But it's not just what people hear or see. It's what they feel. This house has a way of sinking into your bones, like a sickness you can't shake. And it all started with one woman, Madame Delphine Lalaurie." He pauses, letting the name hang in the humid air. A few of the tourists exchange uneasy glances. "Who was she?" another voice pipes up, this time from a man standing in the back. Thomas turns toward him, his lantern casting shadows across his weathered face. Delphine Lalaurie was a woman of high society, beautiful, charming, and as cruel as they come. To the outside world, she was a perfect hostess, the kind of woman who threw grand parties and charmed everyone in the room. But behind these walls, he gestures toward the mansion with the lantern, and the group collectively leans in. Behind these walls, she was a monster. The group is silent now, the usual murmurs and giggles replaced by a heavy tension. "They say her cruelty knew no bounds," Thomas continues, his voice dropping lower. "She kept her slaves chained in the attic, torturing them in ways too gruesome to describe. And when a fire broke out in 1834, exposing her atrocities to the world, the people of New Orleans were horrified. They stormed this house, ready to tear it down brick by brick, but Lalaurie, she vanished. Fled into the night, leaving behind only her victims and the horrors she inflicted on them." Thomas pauses again, scanning the group. "But she didn't leave for good. People say her spirit returned to the mansion, and she's not alone. Those poor souls she tormented, they're still here too, trapped in the place where they suffered most." The lantern flickers, casting a momentary shadow across the second-story window. A woman near the back of the group gasps, clutching her friend's arm. "Did you see that?" she whispers. Thomas doesn't look up. He doesn't need to. He knows the stories all too well. "They say if you stand here long enough," he murmurs, "you might see her face in that window. Or hear her footsteps pacing the upstairs hall. But if you're really unlucky," he stops, letting the words sink in. "If you're really unlucky, you might feel her hand on your shoulder." A nervous laugh escapes one of the tourists, breaking the tension for a moment. But the group quickly falls silent again as the oppressive atmosphere presses down on them. One of the tourists, a bold young man with a camera slung around his neck, steps closer to the gate. "So, has anyone actually gone inside? I mean, recently?" Thomas hesitates. He's heard the stories of brave souls who entered the mansion only to emerge days later, broken, or worse, never emerge at all. "Some have tried," he says carefully. "Ghost hunters, thrill seekers, people who thought they were braver than the rest of us. But the mansion has a way of making sure they don't come back the same. If they come back at all." The bold young man smirks. "Sounds like a great photo op to me." Before Thomas can stop him, the man raises his camera and steps closer to the gate, snapping a picture of the darkened house. The flash lights up the windows, revealing nothing. Or so it seems at first. As the man lowers his camera to check the screen, his expression changes. The smirk disappears, replaced by wide-eyed horror. "What is it?" someone asks, but the man doesn't answer. He just stares at the screen, his hands trembling. Thomas steps forward, peering over his shoulder. The photo shows the second-story window, illuminated by the flash. And in the corner of the frame, faint but unmistakable, is the figure of a woman in a black dress, her face pale and twisted into a cruel smile. The group erupts into murmurs, but Thomas silences them with a sharp gesture. "We need to leave," he says firmly. "Now." As the tourists shuffle away, casting nervous glances over their shoulders, Thomas lingers for a moment, his eyes fixed on the mansion. The faint sound of laughter drifts down from the second floor, soft, sinister, and unmistakably real. With a shiver, he turns and follows the group, the lantern's light fading into the night. Behind him, the mansion looms, silent and watchful, as though waiting for its next visitor. The night air in New Orleans was thick with the scent of rain, the dampness clinging to the cobblestone streets as a full moon crept through the haze. The Lalaurie mansion stood like a hulking monument, a dark silhouette against the eerie glow of the fog. Its windows were like black eyes, unblinking, staring down at the world with a gaze that felt almost alive. Tourists wandered the streets, unaware of the horrors lurking in the shadows. But then, there was the faint sound of footsteps, purposeful, deliberate. They weren't just any footsteps, they were the kind that echoed in the silence, the kind that made people look over their shoulders, even when no one was behind them. Standing at the entrance of the Lalaurie mansion was a solitary figure, a tour guide. His face was pale, his eyes wide with the kind of unease that comes only from knowing too much. For years, he had stood here, at the gates of one of the most haunted places in America, recounting the tragic history of Madame Delphine Lalaurie and the countless atrocities that were once committed within these walls. Yet tonight, something felt different. The usual crowd had gathered, and as always, their excitement blended with a sense of apprehension. They had heard the stories, the whispers, the legends, but there was something more tonight, something unspoken, hanging heavily in the air. The guide cleared his throat, his voice faltering slightly as he began. "Welcome to the Lalaurie mansion, ladies and gentlemen. As most of you already know, this is no ordinary house. It's a place where the veil between the living and the dead is thinner than you can imagine." He paused, allowing the words to sink in. A shiver ran down the spines of those standing close, their eyes scanning the dark windows above. Built in the early 1800s by Madame Delphine Lalaurie, a woman of wealth and privilege, this mansion once housed the very worst of human cruelty, the guide continued, his voice growing more intense with each word. She was a woman of power, of grace, a figure of beauty, at least on the outside. But inside these walls, beneath the polished floors and elegant rooms, was something far darker. Something twisted beyond comprehension. He turned slowly, casting a long, searching look up at the mansion, as though it might come alive at any moment. "You see," he said in a hushed tone, "Madame Lalaurie wasn't just a mistress of high society. She was a monster. And the horrors that unfolded here were so unspeakable, so unimaginable, that even now, more than a century later, the very air in this place seems to hold the weight of what happened." A few of the tourists exchanged uneasy glances, their excitement waning as the night deepened. The wind picked up, rattling the branches of the nearby trees, and the soft rustle of leaves seemed almost to whisper, urging them to turn back. "But those are just stories, right?" one man scoffed, though there was a nervous quiver in his voice. "I mean, it's just an old building." He chuckled nervously, trying to mask his discomfort, but his eyes betrayed him, darting toward the dark windows. The guide didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let the silence stretch between them, thick and heavy. The faint sound of footsteps could be heard behind them, too distant to place, but undeniably real. "Stories, you say?" The guide's voice dropped lower, becoming more intense. He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling knowledge. What if I told you that those stories were based on more than just rumors? What if I told you that the screams of the tortured souls still echo through these halls? That there are those who claim to have seen her, Madame Lalaurie, standing at that window right up there. He gestured toward the second floor of the mansion, where a single, dim light flickered in the distance. A hushed murmur passed through the group. They shifted uncomfortably, eyes locked on the shadowy windows. A woman near the front of the group clutched her purse tighter, her face pale. "Go on," she said, her voice shaking slightly. The guide didn't hesitate. It was the fire of 1834 that revealed the truth, the unspeakable horrors of Lalaurie's actions. Neighbors reported hearing the cries of people locked in chains, hidden away in rooms no one knew existed. Those who escaped told tales of horrific experiments, torture beyond imagining. They said Madame Lalaurie had a passion for cruelty, and she used her position of power to hide her monstrosities from the world. The group stood frozen, their faces pale as the guide continued. But that's not the end of the story. You see, when the authorities finally arrived, they found more than they could ever explain. And Lalaurie? She was gone. Vanished without a trace. No one knows what happened to her. Some say she fled the city. Others say she vanished into the very mansion she'd made a prison for the helpless. A gust of wind howled through the street, making the lanterns flicker and casting long shadows across the group. But the mansion, it remained, the guide continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. And even now, it refuses to let go of its past. He turned back toward the mansion, his gaze lingering on the windows. The group followed his eyes, and in that moment, they all saw it. A flicker of movement. A shadow that seemed to shift in the darkness. No, it couldn't be, someone whispered. But the guide's face was grim. They say Madame Lalaurie still watches over this house, still haunts it, trapped in the very place where her evil deeds were revealed. And tonight, my friends, tonight, the spirits of those she tormented may reach out to you. He didn't have to say another word. The heavy air grew colder, the darkness more oppressive. And the mansion, silent, unmoving, felt alive with an energy that no one could deny. For in that moment, they knew something was watching them from the second-story windows. Something that had been waiting a long time for them to come. The night had fallen heavy, as it always did in New Orleans, with the thick fog rolling in from the Mississippi River, blanketing the streets in an oppressive silence. The sounds of the bustling French Quarter faded into a distant hum, swallowed by the eerie stillness that surrounded the Lalaurie mansion. The air was thick with humidity, and the oppressive weight of history seemed to linger in every breath. A lone figure, wrapped in the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, stood at the base of the imposing iron gates. She was a stranger to the city, a visitor passing through for a short while, but the mansion had drawn her like a magnet, its infamous reputation too tantalizing to ignore. Her name was Emily, and her steps were slow, almost hesitant, as if she could feel the ground beneath her pulse with something unnatural. She had heard the rumors, of course, stories passed down through generations about the Lalaurie mansion and its bloody history. The horrors that had unfolded within those walls, the whispers of torment that never truly ceased. But those were just stories, weren't they? Tales spun by those who couldn't resist the lure of the macabre. As Emily stood there, staring up at the dark silhouette of the mansion against the ink-black sky, she couldn't help but feel something stir deep within her, a curiosity, a pull that seemed to beckon her closer. It was as though the mansion had always been a part of her story, long before she even knew its name. The windows stared back at her like cold, unblinking eyes, and the iron gates, though closed, seemed to welcome her in. In the distance, the tolling of a bell echoed through the air, the sound both soothing and ominous, reminding her of the hour. Midnight. A time when the veil between the living and the dead was said to be thinnest. It was a time when spirits walked freely among the living, unburdened by the constraints of this world. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. It was not a cold she could explain, no breeze, no reason, but a sensation that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the mansion, creeping over her skin, settling like a heavy weight in the pit of her stomach. With a final glance over her shoulder to ensure she was alone, she stepped forward, pushing through the rusted gate, which groaned under her touch. Her breath caught in her throat as the sound echoed in the stillness, and for a brief moment, it felt as though the night itself held its breath. The mansion loomed ahead, its once proud structure now crumbling, its exterior marred by time, neglect, and something darker. The columns that had once supported its grandeur were now bent and cracked, their graceful forms almost skeletal in their decay. The windows, once shining with opulence, were now dull and empty, like hollow eyes staring into the void. But despite the decay, the house still held an undeniable presence, a sense of power, of ancient energy that seemed to pulse from the very walls. It beckoned her closer. Emily had heard the rumors, of course. Everyone who came to New Orleans heard the whispers about the mansion. How, after the fire in 1834, when the atrocities of Madame Delphine Lalaurie had been uncovered, the mansion had become a cursed place, haunted by the souls of the people who had suffered within its walls. The stories spoke of ghostly figures wandering the halls, of the faint sounds of chains scraping against the floor in the dead of night. Of muffled cries, too faint to be fully heard, but somehow piercing the stillness like the thrum of a heart on the edge of a scream. Some said that if you stood too close to the mansion's front door, you could feel the presence of something or someone watching you from the second-floor windows, a woman with pale skin and dark eyes, her face contorted in an eternal, twisted expression of anger and regret. Others claimed that the mansion was cursed, that those who entered never came out the same, or worse, didn't come out at all. Yet Emily was drawn to it. Her feet seemed to carry her forward, each step pulling her deeper into the shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly before her. The fog thickened as she approached the front door, and it felt as though the house itself were closing in around her, the walls leaning inward like a predator preparing to strike. The door was slightly ajar, the heavy wood creaking with an almost unnatural reluctance as Emily pushed it open. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of age and dust, and yet something else lingered, something indefinable. The faintest hint of rot, of death, like the air in a forgotten tomb. She hesitated for a moment, her heart racing in her chest, but curiosity, that insatiable need to uncover the unknown, drove her forward. The floorboards groaned under her weight as she stepped deeper into the house, each creak of the old wood making the silence around her feel even more oppressive. Emily's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the peeling wallpaper, the faded portraits of long-dead ancestors, their eyes following her every move. She swallowed hard, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. It wasn't just the decay of the house that unsettled her, it was something more, something ancient that seemed to linger in the corners of the room, waiting. Watching. The deeper she ventured into the mansion, the more the air seemed to thicken, heavy with the weight of unseen eyes. The air itself felt wrong, as if the very atmosphere of the place was a reflection of the horrors that had occurred here. Suddenly, a soft sound reached her ears, something like a whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. It came from somewhere deeper within the house, from beyond the grand staircase that wound its way up into the darkness. Emily. The voice was faint, yet clear. It was a woman's voice, raspy and broken, as though calling out from the depths of despair. It sent a shiver down Emily's spine, her breath catching in her throat as her pulse quickened. She couldn't tell if it was her mind playing tricks on her or if the mansion truly held something more sinister within its walls. But she knew one thing, the mansion had just acknowledged her presence. And whatever it was that called to her, it was not done with her yet. The streets of New Orleans were shrouded in a thick fog that crept in from the Mississippi River, blanketing the city in an almost suffocating embrace. The evening air was cool, but there was an unsettling stillness to the atmosphere, as if the city itself was holding its breath. The sound of distant footsteps echoed down the narrow, cobblestone streets, but for all the noise, it felt as though no one was truly walking in the city anymore. In the heart of the French Quarter stood the Lalaurie mansion, a crumbling relic from a time long past. Its towering, decaying frame loomed over the surrounding buildings, its windows like dark, hollow eyes watching all who dared approach. On this particular night, as the fog twisted around the iron gates, a small group of tourists gathered beneath the mansion's looming facade. The guide, a middle-aged man with pale skin and a nervous twitch in his eye, adjusted his spectacles as he looked over the group. His voice, though practiced, held a certain edge of unease. It was as if the mansion itself had seeped into his words. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone soft, almost reverential. "What you see before you is more than just a historic house. This is a place haunted by its past, a place of unspeakable horrors." He paused, letting the words linger in the damp air, his gaze briefly flickering toward the mansion's upper floors. For a moment, it seemed as though his words had taken root in the very atmosphere around them. A chill swept through the group, and several tourists instinctively huddled closer to one another. The guide's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a somber, almost fearful smile. "This is the Lalaurie mansion." A few tourists exchanged nervous glances, their curiosity piqued, but there was a shared unease, a collective sense that they had stepped into something far darker than they had anticipated. "Madame Delphine Lalaurie," the guide continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "was once a celebrated member of high society. Beautiful, elegant, wealthy, but she hid a monstrous secret beneath her refined exterior." The wind seemed to pick up as the guide's words lingered, brushing against the stone walls of the mansion, echoing off the nearby buildings. The group leaned in, captivated yet uneasy, drawn into the tale with a mix of morbid fascination and instinctive dread. She was a woman who took pleasure in cruelty, who turned her own mansion into a chamber of horrors, where the cries of her victims, those she enslaved, were drowned out by the sounds of her own twisted desires. The guide's voice became quieter, more intense. "The fire that ravaged the house in 1834 was the only thing that revealed the full extent of her depravity." At this, one of the tourists, a young woman with wide eyes, stepped closer to the guide. "What happened after the fire? Was she caught?" The guide gave her a knowing look, his face now shadowed by a dark uncertainty. "No one truly knows. She vanished that night. Disappeared without a trace." A gust of wind howled down the street, and for a brief moment, the mist parted just enough for the moonlight to spill over the mansion's facade. The pale light illuminated the broken windows and weathered walls, giving the house an almost skeletal appearance, empty, haunted, waiting. The group fell silent, as if the mansion itself had been listening. "Some say she never left," the guide continued. "That her spirit still roams these halls, searching for something, or someone. And those who have dared to spend the night here have, well, they've never been quite the same." He paused again, his gaze moving to the second-story window where, for the briefest moment, a shadow seemed to flicker, just out of reach of the light. The group, eyes wide, followed his gaze, but when they looked back at him, the guide's expression had shifted. He seemed more nervous now, almost as if he was remembering something or as if he had seen something himself. "Some even claim to have seen her," he murmured, almost too softly. "Standing at that very window, watching. Waiting." As if on cue, a sudden chill swept through the air, biting at their skin, and the tourists instinctively drew closer together. The woman who had asked about the fire shivered visibly, a soft gasp escaping her lips. "There's no telling what happens to those who enter," the guide added, his voice barely audible. "The house, it changes people. It feeds on their fear, their curiosity, and their disbelief. It draws you in, until you're no longer sure what's real and what's not." The group stood in uneasy silence as the guide's words hung in the air, each one sinking deeper into their bones. The mansion, despite its dilapidation, seemed to pulse with a strange, almost sentient energy. The fog swirled around them, thickening, as though the very city was conspiring to keep them there. The guide cleared his throat and straightened his back. But tonight, it's not just a story. Tonight, you'll experience it firsthand. Because in this house, the past is never truly gone. It's always with you. Watching. He motioned toward the front door. The heavy iron gates creaked open slowly, as if inviting them in. The group stood frozen for a moment, unsure of whether to take that first step into the mansion or turn back to the safety of the fog-covered streets. A gust of wind whipped through the courtyard, and as it did, something or someone moved in the window above them. A figure. Pale, haunting. It stood there for a fraction of a second, its face obscured by the shadows, then vanished as quickly as it had appeared. A few of the tourists gasped, others held their breath. The guide, his eyes now wide and alert, gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Go ahead, if you're brave enough. But remember, don't expect to leave the same way you came in. As the door creaked open, a faint, guttural whisper slipped out from the shadows of the mansion. It was impossible to tell if it was a voice or just the wind. But it sounded like a plea, a warning. Help me, get out. But it wasn't clear if the voice came from the past or the present. The line between the two had already begun to blur. The Lalaurie mansion stands at the corner of Royal and Governor Nichols Streets, its crumbling exterior and dark windows casting a foreboding shadow over the New Orleans skyline. Beneath the veneer of grandeur lies a history so twisted that even time itself seems reluctant to touch it. Delphine Lalaurie, the lady of the house, was once the epitome of high society. Known for her exquisite taste and grace, she hosted lavish balls and dinners, charming New Orleans elite with her refined manner and beauty. On the surface, there was little to suggest the darkness lurking beneath. Her mansion, an architectural marvel, was a symbol of wealth and power, with its intricate ironwork and pristine white walls standing proudly among the other grand houses of the city. But behind the velvet curtains and glittering chandeliers, Lalaurie's true nature was far more sinister. She kept a tight grip on her slaves, who worked tirelessly to maintain the mansion and cater to her every whim. No one knew the full extent of her cruelty, at least, not until one fateful night in 1834. It began as a simple fire, nothing more than a smoldering heap of ashes, seemingly the result of an accidental blaze. But when the firemen broke down the mansion's doors and forced their way into the burning building, they discovered a sight that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Beneath the thick layers of smoke, a grim reality unfolded. Hidden rooms, chained bodies, and blood-stained floors greeted the rescuers. The enslaved men, women, and children who had been kept in horrific conditions told stories so chilling that many of the firemen retched in disgust. Some were emaciated, their limbs twisted by years of neglect and abuse, others bore marks of unspeakable torture scars from cruel medical experiments, their bodies distorted in ways that no human should endure. The reports of their suffering, ranging from starvation to beatings, mutilation, and even surgical procedures performed without anesthesia, left the city of New Orleans reeling. Yet the most disturbing truth of all was that Lalaurie, the woman who had once been the darling of the city, had orchestrated it all. She had treated her slaves like animals, her acts of cruelty seemingly motivated by nothing more than a perverse desire for control and power. As the fire was extinguished and the full extent of the horror was revealed, the townspeople grew enraged. Word spread quickly, and the mobs gathered outside the mansion, demanding justice for the victims of Lalaurie's sadistic reign. But the once proud socialite was nowhere to be found. She had vanished in the dead of night, slipping away into the shadows like a ghost, never to be seen again. What remained behind was not just the empty mansion but a legacy of terror. Though Madame Lalaurie was never caught, her name became synonymous with depravity. No one knew where she had gone. Some believed she fled to France, while others thought she simply disappeared into the depths of the bayou, forever hiding from the wrath she had earned. In the years that followed, the mansion began to take on a life of its own. It wasn't just a building, it was a cursed monument to a dark history that refused to fade. Tenants who moved in after Lalaurie's departure reported strange occurrences: cold spots in rooms that should have been warm, windows that slammed shut of their own accord, and the unmistakable scent of burning flesh that seemed to cling to the walls, no matter how many times they were cleaned. Those who stayed too long said they felt an oppressive weight, as if someone was watching them. The once opulent ballroom, now gathering dust, had a peculiar echo to it, as if the sounds of laughter and music from the past still haunted its floorboards. One such tenant, a writer named Charles Ashton, rented the mansion in the early 1900s, seeking inspiration for his latest novel. He was intrigued by the mansion's history, but as time passed, his curiosity gave way to unease. Ashton wrote about the strange occurrences in the house, detailing the flickering lights and the sensation of being followed by unseen eyes. But it wasn't until one night, when he ventured into the attic, that he truly understood the mansion's power. The attic door creaked open to reveal dusty old furniture and forgotten relics of the past. But as he stepped inside, a chill swept over him, and he felt the unmistakable presence of something or someone right behind him. Turning quickly, he found himself face to face with nothing but shadows. Yet, when he looked back at the corner of the room, he saw it a pair of hollow, glowing eyes staring at him from the darkness. Terrified, Ashton fled the mansion, leaving behind all his belongings. He never spoke of the encounter again, and his writing career faltered. The mansion, it seemed, had claimed yet another soul. The Lalaurie mansion's reputation continued to grow as the years wore on. Stories of ghostly figures walking the halls at night, of chains rattling in the dark, and of ghostly voices calling out from the empty rooms became the stuff of legend. Some said they could hear the tormented cries of the enslaved victims, echoing through the walls in the dead of night. Others reported seeing shadowy figures dressed in ragged clothing, their faces twisted in agony as they shuffled through the mansion, forever trapped in the limbo between life and death. By the 1940s, the mansion had become a focal point for the curious and the brave. Paranormal investigators from across the country arrived, eager to document the hauntings that had been passed down through generations. Some of them were seasoned professionals, while others were mere thrill seekers looking to get a glimpse of the supernatural. Yet, despite their best efforts, none could explain the house's dark energy. The mansion seemed to resist all attempts to uncover its secrets. In the 1960s, a local woman named Margaret Hanson took up residence in the mansion. She was a historian, drawn to the Lalaurie story and determined to learn more. But after several months of research, her health began to deteriorate rapidly. She lost weight, her skin grew pale, and her mind began to fracture. Margaret began speaking to herself, and the few friends who visited reported that she would often stare into empty corners of the house for hours, as if in conversation with someone invisible. When her body was found, it was as though the life had been sucked from her, her eyes wide with terror, her hands clutched tightly to a faded portrait of Lalaurie. The doctor who examined her was baffled, claiming that her cause of death was heart failure, but no one could shake the suspicion that the mansion had once again claimed another victim. As the decades passed, the mansion's allure only grew. Tourists, eager to witness its grim history firsthand, lined up outside, hoping to catch a glimpse of the supernatural. The mansion was restored to its former glory, but its walls held a secret no amount of renovation could erase. But as night fell and the tourists departed, those who lingered too long could still hear the whispers on the wind, the faint cries of those who had suffered, and the echo of footsteps that were never truly their own. Now, as the mansion stands in the heart of the French Quarter, it serves as both a grim reminder of the horrors of the past and a chilling testament to the enduring power of its dark legacy. Those who dare to enter are warned to leave before the clock strikes midnight, for the Lalaurie mansion is never truly empty. It is a house that still remembers, a house that still waits for the next soul to wander into its grasp. And as history has shown, it is a house that always gets what it wants. The mansion stood tall and brooding under the darkened sky, its silhouette like a jagged wound against the fading stars. The air hung heavy, thick with the weight of secrets, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for something or someone yet to arrive. The wind howled, but it did little to drown out the whispers that seemed to curl around the building's towering walls. Inside, Sarah could feel the weight of the past pressing down on her. Every step she took, the floorboards groaned in protest, as if the house were trying to warn her, urging her to turn back. The temperature dropped with each passing minute, her breath visible in the cold air, even though it was well into spring. There was something off about the atmosphere, an oppressive, almost palpable tension that settled like dust on her skin. As she walked down the main hall, her footsteps echoed off the high, arched ceilings, their sharp sound seemingly swallowed by the vast, empty space. Her equipment, a simple voice recorder and a camera, seemed inadequate for the magnitude of the mansion's history. But Sarah was determined. She was a professional, a seasoned investigator of the paranormal, not someone prone to jumping at shadows. She had seen it all: cold spots, flickering lights, the occasional unexplained noise. She'd debunked countless claims of hauntings, each one with a logical, scientific explanation. But the Lalaurie mansion? This place was different. As she walked deeper into the house, her eyes scanned the walls, which seemed to pulse with a memory of something dark and twisted. Paintings of long-dead aristocrats hung crookedly, their eyes following her with unnerving precision. In the dim light, their faces took on sinister expressions, their painted smiles twisting into something wrong. Sarah could almost feel their gaze, like an invisible force pushing her forward, as if they were urging her to uncover the truth of what had happened here. The upstairs was where the worst of the horrors had occurred. The fire that had destroyed the mansion's rear wing in 1834 had been blamed on a slave who had tried to escape, though many suspected it was no accident. The discovery of the prisoners, those who had been tortured, mutilated, experimented upon, had been so grotesque that it was kept largely out of the public eye. But the rumors, the whispers, the stories, they had lived on. Some claimed the mansion was cursed. Others believed it was a portal to another world, a place where the souls of the victims were trapped forever, unable to escape. And now, as Sarah stood on the threshold of those same haunted halls, she could feel the weight of those stories pressing in on her. She pulled her coat tighter around her body as she ascended the creaking staircase, each step sending shivers through her spine. The hallway above was darker, colder. The faint flicker of her flashlight was the only thing that illuminated her path. The walls, covered in peeling wallpaper, seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, as though the house itself were alive, its heart beating with a rhythm older than time itself. As she reached the end of the hallway, she saw the door, the one that had been closed off, locked for decades, hidden behind layers of dust and cobwebs. Sarah's pulse quickened. This was it. The room. The one room that had been the epicenter of so much torment, so much horror. The room that had never been fully explored, the room that had been sealed away after the fire, when the city had done everything in its power to bury the truth. The door loomed before her, dark and foreboding. She felt a strange pull toward it, like an invisible hand tugging at her soul. She reached for the handle, but as her fingers brushed it, she hesitated. The air around her seemed to thicken, the silence pressing in so hard that it almost hurt. And then, a sound, a whisper, faint and distant at first, but growing louder. It was a soft, pleading voice, muffled and broken. "Help me." Her heart skipped a beat. "Who's there?" Sarah called out, her voice trembling in the stillness. The whisper continued, but it was indecipherable now, as if it was coming from the other side of a thick fog. She pressed her ear against the door, straining to hear. The voice grew louder, clearer. It wasn't just a whisper anymore, it was a soft, desperate cry, as if someone or something was in pain. "Please, don't leave me." The words chilled her to the bone. Her fingers tightened around the door handle, and with a soft click, the door swung open. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. The room was small, barely more than a closet, but its walls were covered in old, yellowed newspaper clippings and faded photographs. They were pinned haphazardly to the walls, as though someone had been desperately trying to piece together a story, a puzzle that had no solution. The room smelled of damp wood and rot, and the faint, lingering odor of something metallic, something that reminded Sarah of blood. In the far corner, there was an old wooden chest, its lid half open. It was covered in dust and cobwebs, as though it had been forgotten for decades. Sarah moved toward it, drawn by an insatiable curiosity. But as her hand reached out to touch the lid, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. A cold breeze swept through the space, causing the photographs on the walls to flutter as though caught in an invisible wind. The whispers returned, louder now, but more frantic, more panicked. Get out while you still can." She jerked her hand back, but the chest lid creaked open on its own. Inside, there was a bundle wrapped in tattered cloth. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as she knelt down to inspect it. The cloth was heavy, as if it were concealing something far more than just an object. She carefully unwrapped it, revealing an old, rusted iron key, a key that seemed out of place in the context of the room. As she held it in her palm, she noticed something etched into the metal, a symbol, twisted and ancient, that seemed to shift before her eyes. It was the same symbol she had seen in several of the photos around the room. But before she could make sense of it, a sharp, cold breeze swept through the room again, and the door slammed shut behind her. The air became thick, suffocating. The whispers turned into screams, jagged and frantic, echoing off the walls. And then, the lights flickered. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized she wasn't alone anymore. The air in the room seemed to shift, and she felt an icy presence moving toward her. The shadows in the corners stretched and writhed, twisting like snakes, coiling toward her. Her pulse raced as her fingers tightened around the key. It was now or never. But just as she turned to flee, the door slammed shut with such force that the walls trembled. The room was closing in, the whispers growing louder, more deafening. The key slipped from her hand, falling to the floor with a sickening thud. The last thing Sarah saw before the darkness consumed her was the reflection in the broken mirror above the chest. Her own face, pale, wide-eyed, and terrified, staring back at her. But behind her, in the reflection, was another figure, tall, shadowy, and faintly glowing. And then, everything went black. The Lalaurie mansion loomed as an unyielding presence, its decaying facade a grim reminder of centuries gone by. As Sarah stood in the shadow of its towering structure, the weight of its history pressed heavily on her shoulders. The gas lamps flickered weakly against the oppressive darkness, casting long shadows that seemed to twist and writhe with each passing gust of wind. The mansion's cold stone walls exhaled the scent of mildew and age, as if the building itself was alive, breathing in the memories of the horrors it had witnessed. Sarah knew the stories, how the house had been abandoned, how the fire had revealed the hidden atrocities. She had heard the whispers, the rumors, the ghostly sightings that had plagued the mansion for generations. But she was not afraid. She was a professional, a skeptic by nature, and she had faced far worse in her years of investigating haunted locations. And yet, something about this place unsettled her in a way no other place had. The air felt thick, suffocating almost, as though it was charged with the energy of something waiting, watching. She walked slowly up the front steps, the sound of her footsteps echoing like a drum beat in the stillness of the night. The mansion's massive wooden door loomed in front of her, dark and unyielding, as though daring her to enter. She hesitated only for a moment before pushing the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the temperature dropped. A chill that seemed to seep into her bones gripped her as she stepped over the threshold. The grand foyer stretched out before her, an expansive space with high ceilings, walls adorned with faded portraits of long-dead aristocrats, and a sweeping staircase that led up to the second floor. Dust floated lazily in the air, disturbed by her presence, but there was something else, something in the silence that felt unnatural. It was as if the house was waiting for her to make the first move. Sarah's breath fogged in the cold air as she adjusted her camera. Her recorder, a small device she'd been using for years to capture EVP, electronic voice phenomena, rested in her hand. She had been here for only 10 minutes, but already she could feel the tension mounting. Every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet, every gust of wind rattling the windows, seemed to whisper of something lurking just beyond her vision. Her first stop was the kitchen, the heart of the house. She had read about it in the books, the place where some of the most grisly acts had taken place. It was said to be the source of the horrible smell that still seemed to cling to the walls, an unbearable stench of burnt flesh that had never quite left the mansion, even after all these years. The kitchen was dimly lit by the weak light of her flashlight. The air was damp, cold, and heavy with an odd smell that made her stomach churn. The stove was long abandoned, covered in layers of dust and soot. She shone her light over the countertops, noting the presence of old cooking implements, tarnished knives, rusted pots and pans, and bowls that had once held food for the mansion's owners but now served as silent witnesses to unspeakable horrors. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Something was wrong. The atmosphere in the kitchen seemed to grow thicker, the air more oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Her flashlight flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to move of their own accord, stretching across the walls and floor, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw a figure standing just beyond the reach of the light. A chill ran down her spine. She swung the beam of light around quickly, but there was nothing there. She laughed nervously, trying to dismiss the unease gnawing at her gut. "You're just being paranoid, Sarah," she muttered to herself. "It's just the house settling. Focus." But deep down, she knew it wasn't just the house. Something about this place was different. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, waiting for her to step too far. Her recorder beeped as it began to pick up static, the familiar hum of interference that often signaled the presence of something unseen. She quickly checked the device, but there was no logical explanation for the strange sounds. It wasn't just static, it sounded like whispers, faint and indistinct, as if voices from the past were trying to make themselves heard. "Hello," she called into the darkness. Her voice was swallowed by the silence. She reached for the door leading to the next room, her hand trembling slightly as she gripped the cold doorknob. As she turned it, the door opened with a slow, eerie creak. The room beyond was small, with peeling wallpaper and faded furniture. The air was thick with the scent of rot, and the floorboards groaned beneath her feet. She stepped inside, her flashlight sweeping across the room, and then froze. There, in the corner, was a large portrait, a painting of Madame Delphine Lalaurie herself, standing tall and proud in the elegant dress of the era. Her eyes, cold and distant, seemed to follow Sarah as she moved through the room. The longer Sarah stared at the painting, the more unnerving it became. It wasn't just the gaze of the woman in the portrait. It was something else, something in the eyes, a flicker of something dark, something alive. A sound behind her. The faintest of footsteps. She whipped around, her heart racing, but there was nothing there, nothing but the room and the oppressive silence. But that's when she heard it. A soft, guttural whisper from the darkness. "Leave, before it's too late." Her breath caught in her throat, her pulse hammering in her ears. She scanned the room again, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The whisper had come from somewhere close enough to send a jolt of icy fear through her veins. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice cracking as she moved toward the corner of the room. "Show yourself." But there was no answer, just the oppressive silence, now thick with dread. It was then that she noticed something strange. The door she had just entered through was now ajar, slightly wider than it had been before. Slowly, hesitantly, Sarah took a step back. The air around her felt wrong, heavier, colder, as though the very walls of the mansion were pressing in on her, suffocating her with the weight of its dark past. She could feel the presence of something unseen but unmistakably there, watching her every move. And then it happened. A sharp, deafening bang echoed through the mansion, making the walls vibrate. The sound was so sudden, so violent, that it sent Sarah stumbling backward, crashing into a chair that tipped over with a loud crash. Her flashlight rolled across the floor, casting erratic shadows on the walls. The temperature dropped sharply, a wave of ice-cold air sweeping over her. Sarah's breath came out in short, panicked gasps. She looked around, her eyes wide with terror, but all she saw were the shadows creeping around the edges of the room, stretching toward her. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, cutting off her escape. The flashlight flickered one last time before going dark. The house seemed to hold its breath. And that's when she heard it again, the faint whisper, this time closer than ever. "You shouldn't have come." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, the sound nearly deafening in the eerie silence. She could feel her chest tightening, the walls closing in. She was no longer alone. There was something in the dark with her. Something that had been waiting. And now it was too late to turn back. The air inside the Lalaurie mansion was thick, heavy with the secrets it had kept for over a century. As Sarah stepped further into the dimly lit foyer, the silence seemed to press down on her chest, an invisible weight. The house was still, yet somehow alive. Each creaking floorboard beneath her feet whispered of its history, of the pain it had witnessed. The light from her flashlight cast long, stretching shadows across the walls, their shapes distorted by the old architecture. The mansion felt like a labyrinth. Every turn, every hallway led deeper into its dark heart, where the past and present seemed to blur and merge into something more sinister. Sarah paused for a moment, taking a deep breath to steady her nerves. She had spent years investigating haunted locations, but there was something uniquely oppressive about the Lalaurie mansion. Perhaps it was the weight of its history, the knowledge that something so vile had taken place in these very rooms. Or maybe it was the sense that the house itself was watching her, waiting for her to uncover its darkest secrets. She took another step, the floorboards groaning under her weight, and began her tour of the mansion. The grand staircase loomed before her, its railing beautifully carved, but covered in layers of dust. She ran her fingers over the banister, feeling the cold, smooth surface, and shivered, as though the house itself was reacting to her touch. Upstairs, the atmosphere grew even more oppressive. The dim light from her flashlight flickered slightly as she moved through the narrow corridors, and she found herself drawn to a room at the end of the hall. It was a guest room, its furniture draped in old sheets, but it felt wrong. The air was thick, like something had been trapped in this room for far too long. A distant sound echoed through the house, sending a chill down Sarah's spine, a faint scraping noise, like nails against wood. She froze, listening carefully. The sound stopped, but the unsettling feeling remained. She continued onward, her heartbeat quickening as she made her way down another corridor, toward what appeared to be the main parlor. The room was grand, but the grandeur was faded. The once luxurious furniture, now moth-eaten and crumbling, seemed to sag under the weight of its dark history. The fireplace, long since abandoned, still held remnants of ash, a grim reminder of the fire that had ravaged the mansion so many years ago. Suddenly, the temperature dropped. Sarah felt it, a sudden, biting cold that settled around her, as though the air had frozen solid. Her breath came out in small, visible puffs, and she pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. The feeling of being watched intensified, but when she turned to look, the room was empty. A soft, almost imperceptible sound reached her ears, a low, guttural hum. It seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, vibrating in her chest. She instinctively raised her camera, recording the eerie noise. It was then that she saw it, a faint, almost translucent figure standing in the corner of the room, just barely visible in the dim light. Her heart skipped a beat. The figure was tall, dressed in old-fashioned clothing that looked like it belonged to a different time, a different world. The figure turned slowly, its face obscured by shadow, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She tried to speak, but no words came out. Her throat felt dry, constricted by an unseen force. The figure moved toward her, its footsteps silent, as though it were floating just above the ground. Sarah instinctively stepped backward, but her feet felt like they were stuck in place, as if the house itself was holding her captive. The figure reached out, its hand a long, skeletal hand stretching toward her. A sharp, piercing sound shattered the silence, and Sarah stumbled backward, her heart racing. She spun around, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but the figure was gone. No. Not gone. She could feel it. The presence, the weight of it, was still there. And then she heard it, an agonizing, echoing scream that seemed to come from the walls themselves, reverberating through the very foundations of the mansion. It was a scream of pain, of torment, a sound that felt as though it came from deep within the earth itself, as if it had been buried here, forgotten, for centuries. Sarah's pulse quickened. She knew this house had a dark past, but this was something beyond anything she had ever encountered before. Something ancient. Something powerful. The scream faded, but the oppressive silence returned, heavier than ever. Sarah's mind raced. She had been in plenty of haunted houses, but this was different. The Lalaurie mansion wasn't just haunted. It was alive, pulsing with a dark energy that refused to be forgotten. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing her flashlight. In the pitch black, she fumbled for the spare batteries in her bag, her hands shaking. As she twisted the flashlight back on, the beam flickered just for a moment. And in that moment, she saw it. The reflection of herself, standing in the room, but she was not alone. There, just behind her, stood another figure, an old woman, her face twisted in a grotesque expression, her eyes wide and empty. She wore a tattered dress, stained with what appeared to be blood. Her hands were raised, reaching toward Sarah. Sarah gasped, stumbling back, but the reflection in the mirror remained unchanged. It was as if the figure was frozen in time, its gaze locked on Sarah, unblinking, waiting. This place is cursed, Sarah thought, her thoughts a whirlwind of panic. She backed away, not daring to take her eyes off the mirror. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get out, but she couldn't. Her body felt heavy, as though the very air was suffocating her. She turned to leave, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The echo of it rattled her bones. Trapped. Panic surged through her as she tried to turn the handle. Locked. She felt it then, the coldness, not from the air, but from the very walls themselves, closing in around her. The house was alive, feeding on her fear. And it wasn't going to let her leave. The whispers returned, louder now, filling the space around her, seeping into her mind. You shouldn't have come. The voice, low and guttural, was different this time, closer. It was no longer just a whisper, it was a presence, wrapping itself around her, pulling her into the depths of the mansion's horrors. Desperation clawed at her throat. She had to escape. She had to. Bang. Something heavy thudded against the door from the other side, sending vibrations through the wood. It sounded like footsteps. The door shook violently again, the sound growing louder, closer. A faint whisper drifted through the air, come closer. The house itself seemed to call to her. Would she dare to follow? The mansion's eerie silence seemed to stretch through the night like a thick, suffocating fog. Sarah stood alone in the grand foyer, the faint smell of mildew and something older, more metallic, hanging in the air. The house seemed to sigh with each creak of its wooden frame, as if the mansion itself was alive, breathing, waiting. The shadows in the corners of the room were thick, nearly tangible, curling like fingers reaching out to touch her. She hesitated at the base of the grand staircase, her heart drumming in her chest. The air was heavy here, thick with the stories of suffering and death. This was where the legends had been born, the stories of chains dragging across the floors, of muffled cries and cold, disembodied whispers that sent shivers crawling down spines. And yet, despite all that, the mansion stood, unyielding and unmoved, as though it had grown stronger with each passing year of abandonment. Just a house, she whispered to herself. A house with a history. Her voice felt weak, almost out of place in this cavernous space. She clutched her recorder tighter, the device's red light blinking steadily as it captured the quiet that surrounded her. Sarah had spent years investigating haunted places, exploring the boundaries of fear, but there was something about the Lalaurie mansion that gnawed at her, deeper than anything she'd felt before. It was as though the very walls had absorbed the cruelty that had once been visited upon them, becoming a vessel for the pain, the suffering, the rage. Sarah swallowed hard, stepping toward the staircase. The grand staircase stretched upward into shadow, its banister carved with intricate patterns that twisted into symbols she couldn't decipher. She felt the weight of centuries bearing down on her as she ascended, the air growing colder with each step she took. The faint creaks under her feet felt unnaturally loud, echoing through the silent house like an ominous warning. She paused at the landing, the second floor now stretching out before her like a labyrinth. There were several rooms, each closed behind old, heavy doors. She raised the flashlight, its beam flickering in the gloom, casting long shadows that seemed to move just out of the corner of her eyes. Nothing about the space felt natural. The air felt thick, oppressive, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. A sound broke the silence, a faint scraping, followed by a low, mournful moan. It was coming from one of the rooms. Her heart leaped into her throat, and instinctively, her hand gripped her camera tighter. The sound wasn't natural, not the kind of creak a house might make settling at night. No, this was something more, something that seemed to carry the weight of a history she couldn't yet comprehend. The kind of sound you hear only when something long dead stirs from its grave. Sarah moved toward the source, her footsteps slow and deliberate. As she passed each door, she felt the hairs on the back of her neck prickle. The mansion seemed to stretch and bend around her, as though the walls were shifting to block her path. She reached for the doorknob of the first room, her hand trembling. She knew she was being watched, but she couldn't pinpoint from where. The pressure in the air was suffocating. Her breath felt labored, as if the house itself was making it harder to draw in a full breath. The scraping sound continued, followed by that low, mournful groan. A voice, perhaps, but not a human one. It sounded too deep, too broken. Sarah's stomach churned. She had come here prepared for the unknown, but this was beyond anything she'd anticipated. She was no longer just investigating, she was being drawn in. With one last deep breath, Sarah turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room beyond was empty, but the air inside was unnervingly cold. The temperature seemed to drop the moment she stepped inside. She shone the flashlight across the walls, revealing faded wallpaper peeling at the edges. There was a single chair in the center of the room, its wooden frame cracked and splintered, the seat sagging as if someone had been sitting there recently. The floor was covered in thick dust, undisturbed except for a small patch near the chair, as if something or someone had stood there, waiting. But it wasn't the chair that held her attention. It was the mirror on the far wall. The mirror was old, its frame ornate and gilded, the glass smudged with age. Yet, it wasn't the reflection it held that unsettled Sarah. It was the faint glow around the edges of the glass, an unnatural light, as though something was trying to push through the surface, something just on the other side. She could feel it, deep in her bones, the wrongness of it. The way the light flickered like a candle struggling against the wind. She stepped closer, her pulse quickening. The reflection stared back at her, distorted, the edges of her own face blurred and warped. But then, as she leaned in, something shifted. A shadow, no, a figure moved in the glass. It wasn't her own reflection. Her breath hitched as the figure in the mirror seemed to materialize, its outline jagged and unclear, but unmistakably human. It was a woman, her face gaunt and hollow-eyed, her skin stretched tight across her bones. She had long, dark hair that hung in matted strands, and her mouth moved, but the words didn't reach Sarah's ears. The sound was muffled, like a whispering wind caught in a storm. She reached out, instinctively drawn to the figure in the mirror, but as her fingers approached the glass, the woman's expression changed. The eyes in the mirror fixed on Sarah with a gaze that was all too familiar, empty, vacant, but full of a deep, unholy sorrow. The figure's mouth parted, and with a voice that felt as though it echoed from beneath the earth, it whispered the name Sarah had dreaded hearing for years. "Help me." The mirror began to crack, fine lines splitting across the surface, spider webbing out from where Sarah stood. The woman's face contorted in pain, her hands pressed against the glass, her fingers trailing down the surface as if she were trying to reach through. The cold in the room intensified, now biting at Sarah's skin, numbing her fingers as she reached toward the mirror, drawn into the figure's desperate gaze. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The shadow disappeared, the cracks in the mirror sealed, leaving only the reflection of Sarah staring back at her, now pale, her face stricken with terror. But when she turned to leave, a sound, soft and slow, reached her ears. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, more distinct. The sound of chains dragging across the floor. Her heart stopped. The sun dipped beneath the horizon, casting a cold and lingering twilight across the mansion. The air was thick with an oppressive weight, as if the house itself was exhaling after holding its breath for far too long. For years, the mansion had stood untouched, its history buried beneath layers of dust and decay. But tonight, the house seemed to stir once more, like an old ghost awakening from its slumber. Sarah stood in the entrance hall, the soft creak of the floorboards beneath her feet the only sound in the stillness. Her breath misted in the cool night air, her body a little more tense than she'd care to admit. The house felt wrong. Not in the way that a haunted location might feel, but in a deeper, more unsettling way. It was as if the walls themselves had absorbed every scream, every whisper, every violent memory, and now, they were simply waiting. Watching. She glanced around the grand hallway, the portrait of Madame Lalaurie staring down at her with cold, calculating eyes. The woman's painted lips seemed to curl slightly upward, as though mocking her. Sarah knew about the mansion's past, the horrors that had occurred within these walls, the twisted experiments Lalaurie had carried out in secret. But standing here, in the shadow of such an unspeakable history, the evil didn't seem like a thing of the past. It felt present. The mansion was alive with the ghosts of its torment. Sarah could almost hear them now, faint whispers echoing down the hall's low, guttural sounds that crawled under her skin, like something was trying to reach out from the other side. The cold air turned into something heavier, colder, and more sinister. She tightened her grip on her flashlight, its beam flickering as if in protest. As she ventured deeper into the mansion, the atmosphere seemed to warp, stretching into a surreal, almost dreamlike quality. The wallpaper, peeling and stained with age, twisted in the dim light, taking on grotesque shapes, like faces contorted in silent screams. The sound of creaking wood echoed through the silence, but Sarah couldn't tell whether it was the house groaning under the weight of years or something more malevolent. Her steps quickened, her senses heightened. The house seemed to breathe, its vast halls stretching endlessly before her, each turn offering more darkness, more chilling shadows. She passed doors, some slightly ajar, others tightly closed. The air in the house felt damp, as if the mansion were still weeping, mourning the horrors it had witnessed. Suddenly, a sharp noise shattered the silence, the sound of something heavy dropping. Sarah's heart leaped in her chest, and she instinctively turned toward the source. But there was nothing. She hesitated. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. But she wouldn't. She had come here for answers, for proof that the stories were real. It was what she had been chasing her entire career, the undeniable evidence that the supernatural was not just a figment of the imagination. She pressed on, deeper into the heart of the mansion. The hallway narrowed, the walls growing closer as she moved, as though the house was beginning to constrict around her. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her footsteps echoing loudly in the oppressive silence. Every so often, she would catch a glimpse of something movement at the edge of her vision, the flicker of a shadow darting just out of reach. But when she turned, nothing was there. The whispers grew louder. No longer faint murmurs, but voices. Real, human voices, agonized, tormented. Screams of pain and fear, distant and muffled but unmistakable. They grew more frantic as she moved, filling the air around her like a dense fog. The temperature dropped rapidly, and Sarah's breath became visible in front of her, each exhale a puff of mist. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold on to some semblance of control. As she rounded a corner, she entered a small room, what appeared to be a parlor. A grand fireplace, though cold and unused for decades, still stood as the room's centerpiece. The faded remnants of expensive furniture lay in disarray, abandoned in the chaos of time. But it was not the room that caught Sarah's attention. It was the figure standing in the corner. For a moment, she thought it was a trick of the light. Perhaps a trick of her own mind. But no, the figure was real. A woman, thin and emaciated, her clothes tattered and torn. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking, but there was something hollow in them, something unnatural. The woman stared at Sarah, her gaze burning through the darkness. The room seemed to distort around Sarah as her heart raced. She opened her mouth to speak, to ask if the woman was real, but no words came out. Instead, a strange, guttural noise rose from the woman's throat, a sound so distorted, so unnatural, that Sarah's stomach churned. It was as if the woman wasn't speaking at all but was somehow trying to communicate from beyond the grave, her voice twisted by the torments she had suffered. The figure raised a hand, long, bony fingers curling toward Sarah, beckoning her forward. And then suddenly the woman's mouth opened wide in an agonizing scream, the sound deafening, almost physical in its force. The air around Sarah seemed to vibrate with it. The walls shuddered as if the house itself was recoiling from the sound. Sarah stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest as the room seemed to close in on her. Her flashlight flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows on the walls. The woman's figure was gone, replaced by a flash of images, twisted faces, tortured souls, all looking at Sarah with eyes that begged for release. The temperature dropped further, and the air became thick with the scent of decay, of rot. It felt as though the very house was exhaling death into her lungs. Her legs trembled, but she forced herself to move, her instincts screaming at her to get out, to escape before whatever had taken hold of the mansion consumed her as well. But the hallway ahead of her wasn't the same as before. The walls were now covered in blood, as though someone had tried to paint over the horrors that had been committed here. And at the end of the hallway, a door opened into a room she hadn't seen before. A dim light shone from within. But it wasn't from a light bulb. The light was far too unnatural. It flickered erratically, like a dying candle, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. Sarah could hear the unmistakable sound of scraping metal, dragging against wood. It was coming from the room. And now, she had no choice but to enter. The air in the Lalaurie mansion grew colder as Sarah ventured deeper into its decaying heart. The house had a way of sucking the warmth from the world outside, leaving only a biting chill that crept beneath her skin, settling into her bones. The heavy silence was broken only by the distant scurrying of rats or the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath her. Every step she took echoed through the hollow halls, as if the house itself were listening, waiting. The flickering light of her flashlight seemed to barely penetrate the vast darkness, casting eerie shadows against the walls that seemed to shift and twist, taking on grotesque shapes. Every now and then, she thought she caught a glimpse of something moving at the corner of her eye, a figure vanishing just out of reach, or a flash of something human standing still, watching her. But when she turned, there was nothing there. Only the oppressive, suffocating atmosphere of the mansion. She tried to shake the unease creeping up her spine, chalking it up to nerves. After all, she had encountered paranormal activity before. She was a professional. Her career was built on debunking myths, exposing hoaxes, and revealing the truth behind so-called haunted places. But this place, it was different. There was a palpable presence here, something that could not be explained away by logic or reason. Her footsteps led her to the grand staircase, its banister coated in layers of dust, its wood groaning with age. The walls were lined with faded portraits of long-forgotten faces, their eyes seemingly following her as she ascended the steps. She felt their judgment, their disapproval. The weight of their gazes was overwhelming, as if they were warning her not to go further, not to uncover the mansion's secrets. But Sarah's resolve was unwavering. She had come for answers, and she would not leave without them. As she reached the second floor, the temperature dropped even further. Her breath became visible in the air, like a fog that swirled around her face. She paused, checking her equipment once again. Everything seemed in order. The voice recorders were working, and her camera was still running. It wasn't until she reached the end of the hallway that she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing on the floor behind her. Slow. Deliberate. They were getting closer. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. There was no way someone else could be here. She was alone. The guide had left her with nothing but a warning and a hesitant smile. And yet, the sound was undeniable. Sarah spun around, expecting to see someone standing there, but the hallway was empty. Just the same faded wallpaper, the same peeling wood, the same rows of portraits. No one. But the footsteps didn't stop. She could hear them now, circling behind her, as if someone or something was pacing back and forth just out of sight. Her mind raced. Was it a prank? The house was old, certainly, but was it possible there was a hidden corridor, another presence in the mansion? She pulled out her voice recorder, the blinking red light reflecting in the darkness. She spoke, her voice steady, but the underlying fear was impossible to hide. Is there someone here with me? The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, her recorder crackled, the hiss of static filling the air, followed by a voice low, guttural, and unmistakably human. Help me. The hairs on the back of Sarah's neck stood on end. It was a voice, though twisted and strained, as though it had been trapped for far too long, unable to escape. She held the recorder to her ear, but it was no longer the voice of a person in pain. No, this voice was more of a command, an order, an invitation to something far darker than any ghost she had encountered before. Help me. The words came again, followed by a long pause, a breathless silence, then, you shouldn't have come. Her breath caught in her throat. This was no ordinary haunting. The air was thick with it now, like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. Every inch of the house seemed to be alive with the echoes of suffering, the faint whisper of chains dragging across the floor, the crackle of burning flesh. It was as though the walls themselves were stained with the ghosts of those who had endured untold horrors. A distant sound broke the trance, soft, muffled, almost like a rhythmic pounding, coming from somewhere deep within the mansion. Her eyes darted toward the farthest corner of the hallway, where the noise seemed to be originating. It was as if the house were breathing, pulsing in time with the sound, slow and deliberate, a deep, haunting rhythm that echoed from below. Without thinking, she moved toward it, her feet carrying her forward as if guided by some unseen hand. The staircase that led further down was hidden behind a rotting wooden door at the end of the hall. She grabbed the brass handle, its cold surface sending a shock through her fingers, and turned it. The door groaned loudly as it opened, revealing a set of narrow stairs leading into complete darkness. With a steady breath, Sarah descended. The deeper she went, the more suffocating the air became. It smelled of decay, of wet earth, of something ancient and forgotten. At the bottom of the stairs was a hallway lined with doorways, each one dark, uninviting. But one door at the far end was slightly ajar. A faint light flickered from within, casting strange shadows on the walls. It was this door that drew her in, as if calling to her, coaxing her closer, urging her to step inside. When she reached it, her hand was trembling as she pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, the sound reverberating through the empty halls. Inside was a room unlike any other she had seen in the mansion, a cold, sterile chamber, its walls covered with strange symbols and markings, each one etched into the stone. At the center of the room was a pedestal, and upon it, a weathered book lay open. Sarah approached cautiously, her breath shallow. The book was old, its pages yellowed with age, its leather cover cracked and brittle. She hesitated for a moment before reaching out and flipping it open. As her fingers brushed against the pages, the temperature in the room plummeted. The lights flickered again. And then, from somewhere deep within the mansion, she heard it. A scream. Loud. Raw. Filled with agony. It seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The voice was unearthly, distorted, as though it had been trapped in this very room for centuries, waiting for anyone to finally listen. The room spun around her, the walls bending and stretching as if the very air had thickened. The shadows seemed to grow longer, darker, and more ominous. The sound of chains rattling echoed through the air, followed by another, more distant, agonized scream. And then the lights went out completely. In the pitch-black room, Sarah's heart raced, every nerve in her body screaming at her to run. But she couldn't. Her feet were rooted to the ground as if the mansion itself had claimed her, as if it was now her prison, just like it had been for the countless souls who came before her. Her flashlight flickered once more, casting a feeble light across the room. For a split second, she thought she saw someone standing at the edge of the doorway. It was a figure, pale and gaunt, wearing tattered clothing. Their eyes were hollow, empty. And as the light flickered again, the figure smiled. A smile that was not human. "You shouldn't have come," the voice whispered again, but this time, it was no longer a warning. It was an invitation. Sarah had always prided herself on her skepticism. As a paranormal investigator, she was used to walking into haunted spaces with a critical eye, ready to debunk myths and expose exaggerations. But there was something about the Lalaurie mansion, something that lingered in the air like an unseen presence that stirred an unease she couldn't shake. She had prepared herself for this moment. Cameras, voice recorders, EMF detectors, every tool was at her side. She was here for one reason, to uncover the truth behind the mansion's dark past. The rumors, the whispered tales, the stories of madness and ghosts that refused to rest, it all led her here, to this notorious house. The tour guide, a man named Paul, eyed her warily as he locked the front door behind her. His face was drawn, pale, as though the mansion itself had worn him thin over the years. He'd heard her plans to stay the night, to search the mansion for any signs of the paranormal. "You sure about this, miss?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. "People don't come out the same after spending a night here. Some say they lose themselves, like they leave part of their soul behind." Sarah gave him a thin smile, brushing off his concerns. She had heard it all before, the warnings, the ghost stories, the tales of haunted houses. It was all part of the allure. She'd faced things far darker than what this house could throw at her. She stepped past him and into the mansion, the heavy door groaning as it closed behind her. The air inside was thick, almost oppressive. The scent of old wood and dust clung to her, but beneath it was something more, something foul, like rot. It was the smell of a place that had witnessed too much suffering. Her shoes creaked against the floorboards as she moved further in, her flashlight casting long shadows that danced across the walls. The mansion was unnervingly quiet, save for the occasional scuttling of rats in the walls. The silence was heavy, broken only by the distant murmur of the city outside. Sarah moved with purpose, her voice recorder in hand, documenting everything. She spoke aloud to her camera, her voice a mixture of professional detachment and curiosity. Lalaurie Mansion, once the home of Madame Delphine Lalaurie, infamous for her cruelty toward enslaved people. Many say the house is cursed, that the spirits of the tormented still roam its halls. As she ventured deeper, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The house seemed to be watching her, the walls alive with unseen eyes. Her first hour inside passed without incident, just the faint buzz of equipment and her own footsteps echoing through the vast, empty rooms. But as time stretched on, Sarah couldn't deny it, something was off. Her EMF detector beeped sporadically as she passed by an old, ornate mirror hanging crookedly in the hallway. The needle flickered, then spiked momentarily before settling back down. It was probably a glitch, old wiring, or maybe the proximity of electrical appliances in the nearby rooms. Nothing to worry about, she told herself. She continued, her flashlight sweeping across faded portraits on the walls. Portraits of the Lalaurie family, faces frozen in time, staring with empty eyes. It was then that she noticed the temperature had dropped. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled as the air around her grew colder, colder than the chill outside. She rubbed her arms, trying to shake off the creeping dread that clung to her skin. In the distance, she thought she heard a faint whisper. She stopped, her heart racing. No one else is here, she reminded herself. It's just the house. Old houses make noises, play tricks on you. She turned back to her equipment, adjusting the voice recorder. She was about to speak again when a sudden chill rushed through the hallway, the temperature dropping so rapidly that she could see her breath misting in the air. That was when she heard it, the sound of soft, agonizing cries. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible, like the distant sobs of someone in pain. But as the sound grew louder, the hairs on the back of Sarah's neck stood on end. The cries were hollow, raw with desperation, too real to be just the wind. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned toward the stairs, where the sound seemed to be coming from. Without thinking, she took a step forward, then another, drawn to the source of the cries. The hallway narrowed as she ascended the staircase, her footsteps muted by the plush carpet. The old wood creaked beneath her, and with each step, the cries grew louder, sharper, more frantic. She reached the top of the stairs and paused, her flashlight scanning the hallway. A cold breeze brushed against her skin, sending a shiver down her spine. The cries now echoed, seeming to come from all directions, but it was impossible to tell exactly where they were coming from. At the end of the hallway, a door stood ajar, the faintest sliver of light leaking from within. Without a second thought, Sarah approached it. The doorknob was old, tarnished, but it turned easily in her hand. Inside, the room was dim, lit only by the weak glow of her flashlight. The air was suffocatingly still, the silence almost unbearable after the cries that had filled her ears just moments before. Her eyes scanned the room. Chains, rusted and broken, scattered across the floor like remnants of some long-forgotten nightmare. Tools, long-forgotten implements of torment, lined the far wall. Bloodstains stained the floor, dark and dried, a testament to the horror that had once been. Her breath caught in her throat as her flashlight flickered. She turned the beam toward the back of the room, her pulse racing. And then, just as her fingers brushed the edge of a rusted iron chair, the door slammed shut behind her. The sound was deafening, a sudden, forceful boom that rattled the walls and sent her stumbling back. Sarah's flashlight blinked, casting the room into near darkness. Panic surged in her chest as she tried to flick the switch on her flashlight, but it refused to work. The darkness pressed in around her, thick and suffocating. Then she felt its cold breath against the back of her neck. She froze, every muscle tensing as a voice, low and guttural, whispered directly into her ear, "You shouldn't have come." She spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there. The room was empty, yet the air around her felt thick with the presence of something unseen, something ancient. The whispers grew louder, circling her, as if the very walls themselves were alive, feeding on her fear. Her pulse hammered in her ears, the sound deafening as she backed away toward the door. But the handle wouldn't turn. She tugged at it, desperation creeping into her voice as she yanked with all her strength. The door refused to open. The cries from the hallway began again, closer now. Louder. Tortured. It was as if the walls themselves were alive with the suffering of the past. Sarah's breath came in shallow gasps, her body trembling as the air seemed to grow thicker. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't escape. In the dark, a shadow moved, a figure, tall and indistinct, moving toward her. And in that moment, Sarah realized, with growing horror, that she had stepped into something far worse than a haunted house. She had awakened something that would never let her leave. And then everything went black. Sarah adjusted the strap of her camera bag and surveyed the grand interior of the Lalaurie mansion. The once opulent entryway, with its ornate moldings and high ceilings, had a hauntingly hollow quality to it now. The air felt thick, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for her to make her move. Every footstep she took echoed unearthingly in the empty space, amplifying the silence that pressed against her. Despite her calm demeanor, she could feel the weight of the mansion's dark history bearing down on her. She set up her equipment with methodical precision. The cameras were positioned in key spots, facing the long hallway and the grand staircase leading up to the upper floors. Her voice recorder clicked on as she began to speak. "This is Sarah Davenport, paranormal investigator. I've come here to explore the truth behind the Lalaurie mansion, a place with a long and blood-chilling history. I'll be documenting my experience as thoroughly as possible. Let's see what this house has to show me." A gust of wind rattled the windows, and Sarah instinctively turned toward the sound, though the air inside felt stagnant and still. She brushed it off as a natural draft, but her nerves were already on edge. She had heard the stories of people hearing footsteps behind them, of shadowy figures crossing the corners of their vision, of an overwhelming feeling of being watched. But she was determined to keep her composure. This was what she did. She wasn't afraid of a ghost story. Yet, as she glanced toward the grand staircase, something in the air shifted. She couldn't place it, just an odd sensation that something, or someone, was there. She turned back to her equipment, adjusting a microphone that had slightly shifted out of position. When she looked up again, the hallway appeared darker. "Okay," she muttered to herself, taking a deep breath, "I'm just overthinking things." She spoke aloud, trying to break the tense silence. "I'm here to uncover the truth. No distractions." But as she made her way toward the grand staircase, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The sound of her boots tapping against the old wood floor felt far too loud, too intrusive. She paused, listening intently. All she could hear was the faint hum of the wind outside and the creaking of the house settling. Still, the sensation persisted. She scanned the empty hallway, but no figure emerged from the shadows. With a quiet sigh, Sarah climbed the staircase. The walls, lined with faded portraits of stern-looking men and women, seemed to leer at her, their eyes following her every movement. The soft creak of the steps beneath her feet was the only sound as she ascended. At the top, she found herself standing in a long, dim corridor. The wallpaper was peeling in places, and the floorboards creaked underfoot. She could feel the temperature drop slightly as she made her way down the hall. The house was cold, but it was more than just the chill of old brick and timber. It felt like the temperature had dropped, as if something unseen had stepped into the room with her. She stopped in front of a door, the only one on the left side of the hall. A faint draft brushed her skin, and the room behind the door seemed impossibly dark. "Let's see what's inside," she murmured, the words almost a challenge as she reached for the doorknob. It was warm against her hand, and with a creak, the door swung open. The room was small, filled with large wooden furniture covered in dusty sheets. There was an oppressive stillness here, as if the room had been untouched for decades. At the far end was a large mirror framed in dark, intricate wood, its surface tarnished with age. The reflection that met Sarah's eyes was blurred, making it difficult to discern the details. For a moment, Sarah stood in the doorway, surveying the room. Something about the space felt wrong, too quiet, too expectant. Her flashlight flickered slightly before stabilizing. Her heartbeat quickened as she stepped into the room, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. The mirror called to her, its surface seemingly undisturbed by the years that had passed. It felt almost alive, as though it were watching her, waiting for her to come closer. She shone her flashlight on the mirror. The dim light bounced off its cloudy surface, casting long shadows across the room. The distorted reflection of the room felt unsettling, as though it didn't quite belong. She took a step forward, drawn in by the mirror's eerie allure. The air around her seemed to thicken, and she felt a sudden coldness seep into her bones. She tried to shake it off, but the pressure in the room was suffocating. Her breath came in shallow gasps. Something was off. Snap! The sound of something breaking echoed in the distance. Sarah froze, straining her ears to listen. It wasn't far, perhaps from downstairs. The thud of a heavy object hitting the floor, followed by the unmistakable sound of wood scraping across stone. Sarah turned quickly toward the door, but when she looked back, the reflection in the mirror had changed. At first, it was subtle. A shadow in the corner, a movement just outside the frame. But then, as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, Sarah saw it, a figure standing in the mirror, just behind her. It was faint at first, but the longer she stared, the clearer it became. A pale, gaunt face. Eyes hollow with dark circles. She could see the outline of a woman, dressed in a flowing gown, but the figure was translucent, part of the reflection and part of the room. Her heart pounded in her chest as the figure's eyes seemed to fixate on her, and for a split second, Sarah was sure the reflection was smiling at her. A cold shiver raced down her spine. She turned quickly, but the room was empty. Her flashlight beam danced over the walls, the furniture, and the mirror, but there was no one there. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching her. The weight of the room seemed heavier now, as if the walls themselves had grown closer. Before she could fully process what had just happened, her flashlight flickered again. This time, it didn't come back on. The room plunged into darkness. Her breath caught in her throat as she fumbled for her backup flashlight. Her hands shook, and the sudden silence felt deafening. Then, the floorboards groaned beneath her, a low, menacing creak that echoed from behind. She spun around, but there was nothing there, no shadow, no movement. Just the deep, unsettling silence. But something in the air had changed. The temperature had dropped significantly. She could see her breath clouding in front of her face. The hairs on her arms stood up, and a sense of dread flooded her senses. There it was again. A soft, muffled cry. The unmistakable sound of a woman sobbing. Sarah's pulse quickened. She wasn't alone. The mansion had never let her leave. It had been waiting for her to come inside. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaking. There was no answer, only the muffled sobs that seemed to grow louder. They were coming from behind her, just inches away. She turned, her flashlight beam falling on a door at the far end of the room that she hadn't noticed before. It was ajar, the space between the door and the frame narrow but just enough to let a sliver of pale light slip through. The sobs grew louder, as if pleading for her to come closer. With a mix of hesitation and resolve, Sarah took a step forward, pushing the door open slowly. What lay behind it would change everything. Sarah's heart pounds in her chest as she spins, her flashlight sweeping the room in a desperate search for anything solid to latch onto. The air is thick, suffocating, and the faint cries that had echoed earlier now seem to come from every direction. Her breath comes in shallow gasps as the walls themselves seem to breathe, expanding and contracting with a life of their own. The temperature drops, each exhale of air turning to mist before her eyes. The shadows begin to twist, stretching unnaturally along the walls. They seem to grow, thick and heavy, their edges blurring into something far worse than mere darkness. Figures materialize from the gloom, tall, gaunt shapes with hollow eyes and twisted faces, mouths agape in silent screams. Her body trembles violently, and she stumbles backward, her hands clawing at the walls for support. "Who's there?" she croaks, her voice barely audible in the oppressive silence. She tries again, her throat tight with panic, but no words come out. The shadows seem to laugh, or at least, that's what it feels like as a low hum vibrates through the floor, setting her teeth on edge. The walls pulse in time with the hum, and she feels as if she's drowning in the sound, her ears filling with static. Her camera continues to record, its red light blinking ominously in the corner of her eye. She turns toward it, seeing herself on the small screen, but the reflection is distorted, her face a mask of terror. Her own eyes, wide and pleading, stare back at her, but the shadows around her grow larger, closer. The figures in the room close in, their movements jerky, unnatural. One of them steps forward, its face a grotesque blur of anguish. "Please, please help me," Sarah whispers, her voice cracking. Her back hits the corner of the room with a dull thud, and she sinks to the floor, her body now trembling uncontrollably. The shadows move faster now, swirling, circling her. The floorboards creak beneath their weight, the air thickening as if the mansion itself is coming alive. Her breath quickens as she claws at the floor, trying to find some escape, but there is none. The door is still locked, the window sealed tight. She's trapped. One of the figures reaches out, its bony hand stretching toward her face. Her eyes widen in horror as it draws closer, the air around her growing colder with each passing second. She gasps as the hand brushes against her cheek, its touch like ice. "Help, please," she whispers again, but her voice is so small now, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. The shadows loom over her, their twisted faces now inches from hers, their eyes empty, hollow. Then, the pressure around her chest tightens, as if something invisible is squeezing the breath from her lungs. Her hands fly to her throat in a desperate attempt to breathe, but nothing helps. The walls are closing in, and with each heartbeat, the shadows grow larger, more suffocating. The camera falls from her trembling hands, its lens aimed directly at her face. For a moment, there is nothing but the sound of her own ragged breathing, the oppressive silence broken only by the low hum of the unseen forces. Then, the room grows utterly still, as if the very air is holding its breath. The last thing the camera captures is Sarah's terrified face, her eyes wide with unspoken terror as the shadows rush toward her, their forms twisting and undulating. The screen flickers, distorting her features, before it goes black. The next morning, the mansion is silent. The sun barely breaks through the thick fog that surrounds it, casting long, eerie shadows across the overgrown garden. A faint smell of mildew and decay lingers in the air, but no one dares to approach. The mansion stands like a forgotten relic, its windows dark and unwelcoming. The tour guide arrives as usual, his footsteps slow and deliberate, as if he knows something is wrong. He pauses at the door, his hand hovering over the knob. The house feels heavier today, somehow. He unlocks the door, and the silence inside is suffocating. The dust in the air swirls lazily, undisturbed, as if no one had been there in years. The camera, still on the floor in the corner of the room, flickers to life. The tour guide steps inside, his eyes scanning the empty room. His gaze falls on the camera, and he walks toward it cautiously, kneeling to pick it up. He presses play, and the footage starts rolling. Sarah's face, twisted in terror as the shadows close in on her. He shudders, his fingers trembling as he watches the images flicker, the distorted shadows consuming her. When it ends, the screen remains black for a long, agonizing moment. The guide stands there, frozen, unsure of what to do, but something catches his eye movement. A flicker of white in the upstairs window. He turns sharply, his heart racing in his chest. There, in the second-story window, is a face. Pale, lifeless, and staring directly at him. Its eyes are empty, like two hollow voids staring into his very soul. It is a woman's face, twisted in a silent scream. Sarah's face. Or is it? The guide's breath hitches in his throat as the face vanishes, fading into the dark shadows of the mansion. He stumbles backward, horrified. His mind races, but before he can take another step, the door slams shut behind him with a force that rattles the windows. He turns the lock. The house is still. Silent. But is it truly empty? The tour guide backs away from the mansion, his gaze never leaving the dark windows. The last thought on his mind, was it Sarah who stared from that window? Or was it something or someone far worse? Something that had been waiting, watching, for far too long. And now, it was waiting again.